All right, well, thanks for coming out for our speaker today. We are quite happy to have with us Professor Andrew Fiala from Fresno State University. I've known Andy for a number of years since we were graduate students together at Vanderbilt. And he has been doing a lot of work on pacifism. A few years ago, he published a book called Practical Pacifism. And more recently, he is author of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on pacifism. And today what he was going to do is to talk about the variety of pacifist arguments there are and to discuss them. So please join me in welcoming to our department, Andy Fiala.
Thanks. Thanks for your hospitality. It's been a nice visit. Appreciate it. Yeah, Rob and I actually lived together for a while. Some old stories about that. Anyway,
Still friends.
it's
Still preaching pacifism.
kill us. What I thought I'd do today is I'd go basically through the Stanford Encyclopedia article and kind of explain what I did in that article. And the first half is conceptual analysis, trying to figure out what pacifism is. And then the second half I'll talk about some pro and con arguments for pacifism. The second part, by the way, is, I don't know, probably more, will generate more conversation, because most people think pacifism, I think this is true, most people think pacifism is pretty much a stupid idea. So there's a lot of objections that are thrown about, and I'm going to try to argue that maybe some of those objections don't work. But the first part which is on the handout here. This is the first 5 points on this handout. This handout is basically the outline of the article. We're going to try to figure out what pacifism is, and the answer is that it's not just one thing. It's a complicated topic. It's kind of a family resemblance sort of term. It includes a lot of different things, but generally, pacifism is understood as the idea that war is wrong, with war being the primary focal point. But pacifist arguments and pacifists can extend beyond war and take in claims about the death penalty, state violence in general. Pacifists may want to talk about all sorts of killing, including personal self-defense. Some pacifists might want to say that, well, pacifism should extend out and contain or concern all sentient beings, that should be kind of vegetarianism should be included here. And other pacifists want to say that pacifism is part of a way of life, that it's kind of religious, spiritual commitment that's part of a larger life project. So it's a complicated topic. Let me direct your attention to point 1 here. And one of the problems, or one of the reasons that pacifism is a complicated topic, is because peace, the idea of peace, is itself a kind of family resemblance sort of term. As is the idea of war, by the way. We'll talk about that at some point here. But it's not exactly clear if pacifism is about making peace, like what the etymology of the word says, that pacifists are peacemakers. What is it that they're making? Not clear. There's a variety of answers to this. I'll give you some possibilities here, and this is not an exhaustive list. The first one here, peace as slavery or submission, it might be that peace means that we just give in to everyone. We just give up. Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau calls this or describes this as the peace of the Cyclops cave, where there's a kind of, it's not exactly peace, but the guys in the Cyclops cave can't do anything to fight back. So in a sense, that may be a kind of peace. Slavery, submission. Most pacifists don't have this in mind, but maybe it fits with a kind of non-resistant pacifism where you're just not allowed to fight back, so it just means that the bad guys win. Second possibility in terms of defining peace, peace might be a modus vivendi or a kind of détente situation, a stalemate, a truce, where people talk about the Cold War as a time of peace, even though it's a time of war at the same time. In the Cold War, war is in the title of it, the word we use to describe it, but it was peaceful in a certain sense because there were no outright hostilities. Now, is that what pacifists have in mind? Probably not. One of the problems, of course, with the Cold War is that when both sides are armed to the teeth, at any minute there could be an outbreak of horrendous kind of hostilities. And yet there's something to this idea that, well, maybe all we want is just an end to hostilities. Maybe that's all peace amounts to. Let me point you to the third possibility for peace here. This is the peace of a just and tranquil order. We're getting closer probably to what most people who call themselves pacifists have in mind with regard to peace. And this idea of peace of a just and tranquil order, this language is kind of Augustinian language that talks about there's got to be order and harmony in the world. It may be tied into liberal ideas about the democratic peace, and you might think of like Francis Fukuyama or Michael Doyle, and Rawls talks about this a little bit, that when people's political needs are satisfied, that maybe then we have a kind of peace. So the contemporary theorists that talk about this want to claim that liberalism provides this. Moreover, it's kind of Fukuyama Doyle sort of claim. The claim is made that when liberal democracy spreads around the world, then we'll have peace because, as Kant suggested, liberal democracies don't fight against each other. There's nothing to fight about because basically we agree about what human nature should be and how we should allow human rights to be respected, etc. Notice, though, by the way, this idea of peace of a just and tranquil order. It might be possible to fight in order to bring this sort of peace about. The just war tradition tells us all about this, that one of the primary motivations for fighting a just war is to ensure justice and to provide for tranquility. That's how Augustine interprets this idea of peace of a just and tranquil order. But maybe that's what pacifists have in mind when they're talking about peace. Maybe. Fourth one, this idea, I call it positive peace. There's a variety of ways of talking about this. There seems to be a more substantial idea about what peace should be. Not just liberal toleration where we agree to hate each other, but we put our weapons in the closet kind of thing. There seems to be a more robust sense that many pacifists, self-proclaimed pacifists, have about what peace should look like. That it should involve solidarity, mutual respect, maybe love and generosity, kind of genuine human community developing. Maybe that's the big idea that pacifists are aiming at. Again, there's going to be a variety of answers about what it is that pacifists are actually aiming at. Probably, depending on how you understand peace, is also going to tell you about what pacifists can or cannot commit themselves to by way of violence, and how far their pacifism will extend. This last one about positive peace, probably this connects into more religiously oriented, absolute versions of pacifism. This is, I don't know, the kind of Gandhian idea of a village that lives together in harmony, the commune kind of idea. That's where positive peace would occur. And that may require spiritual transformation for that to happen. The third one, by the way, just to remind you, is more political. It has to do with political institutions that will provide for and defuse hostility within social structures. Okay, that's kind of an attempt to define peace. There's other things we could talk about with regard to what peace is. Peace might also have nothing to do with the outside world. It may all be interior. Martin Luther King Jr. at one point talks about internal peace. You have to eradicate negative emotions, eradicate self-violence. So you got to overcome hatred, overcome anger, resentment. Maybe that's the kind of peace people are talking about.
Wouldn't that be an aspect of the positive peace?
Probably, yeah. And notice there, that's if that's kind of the holistic goal, the outside and the inside are going to connect together. It's going to be solidarity among brothers, and also self-actualization within the individual. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Let's move down to the second point: varieties of pacifism. By the way, how this came about, I talked to the guys at the Stanford Encyclopedia. I said, well, you need an article on peace and pacifism. They said, okay. And then I started to really think about it and realized, oh my God, this is a huge topic that's going to be way more than a 15-page encyclopedia article. And I tried to come up with kind of a scheme to, lay out all these different ideas about pacifism. And they're kind of, I had the charts, and I could never make the charts quite work out properly. And so there's some overlap among these different ways of categorizing pacifism. Hopefully you'll see some of the overlap. First one, what I call absolute versus contingent pacifism. Absolute pacifism, and here I'm talking about where pacifism is located and how it's understood in terms of its moral call upon us, I guess. The absolute pacifist will say that war is always wrong. That is, if we understand pacifism only as anti-war, is different version of pacifism might say that all violence is always wrong. It might extend again to personal violence, etc. But the claim is that there are no exceptions, right? This is an absolute duty or requirement that we must fulfill. Often absolute pacifism is tied into a religious worldview which says that God commands this sort of behavior. We're going to see absolute pacifism, this absolute version returns. It often has a kind of deontological aspect, that there are duties that must be upheld regardless of the consequences. Opposed to this is contingent pacifism. And contingent pacifism, I get this word from John Rawls. He talks about contingent pacifism towards the end of the theory of justice. He talks about conscientious objection, conscientious objectors. And he says that, well, it's possible to say that all war is wrong, but most people don't really mean that. What most people mean is that this war is wrong. This particular war is wrong. Or if it's not just this war, it's this war system or this institution of militarism that's wrong. And it's possible to imagine, on this contingent view, that, well, some wars could be justifiable, some violence could be justifiable, but just not this one, just not this type of violence, or just not this system of institutions or military projects. Contingent pacifism has been espoused, I think probably the most famous proponent of this is Bertrand Russell. And you may know Russell, he articulated all kinds of pacifist arguments. He was opposed to nuclear weaponry, and yet he supported the Second World War. And people, would ask, well, how's that possible? You call yourself a pacifist, and yet you support what's going on in the Second World War. And Russell described his position as what he calls relative political pacifism. You can see how the term is quite getting complexified here. Relative political pacifism. What Russell means by this is it's relative to the context. So I think what he means by this is, for the most part, most contexts will lead us to say that war is wrong. But there may be other contexts in which the claim that war is wrong doesn't apply. So the context, history, all this matters. In terms of relative political pacifism, Russell wants to emphasize that it's war he's talking about and not other kinds of human activities. So he doesn't say anything, at least in a couple of articles where this comes up, he doesn't say anything about personal violence, whether one could defend oneself against an attacker. He's talking about the war system, he's talking about political violence. Different sort of contingent pacifism may, again, in terms of thinking about particular wars and what's wrong with them, it may be a prudential concern and not a moral concern. That's important to recognize that you might say, for example, well, this war is no good because we don't have the right kind of army, we don't have the right amount of money, looks like we'll lose, or it looks, from another different perspective, it looks like we're going to go and completely destroy a civilization, and that's not what we should be doing because it'll have long-term negative effects for international stability or whatever. It may be prudential concerns that give rise to pacifism, not moral concerns, as opposed to the absolute version which says that it's the moral concern that matters, that war is always wrong. Let me move you to 2.2, which is the difference between maximal and minimal pacifism. I made this up. It doesn't really show up in the literature anywhere, but what I mean by this is how much or how far pacifism is supposed to apply. Maximal pacifism would say that all kinds of violence are wrong. And it might include, I mentioned this at the beginning, it might include way more than war. Not just that war is wrong, but the death penalty is wrong, suicide is wrong. You could imagine a kind of Catholic, consistent ethic of life, seamless garment kind of view, which says abortion, euthanasia, and all this. Anything that involves killing is wrong. Maximal extension of the idea that violence is wrong. As opposed to a more minimal point of view, which says, well, it's just war that's wrong. Now here we get into the complication of what are we talking about when we use the word war. Is it just international war that's wrong? Civil war? What about that? Is that wrong? What about rebellion? What about insurgency? What about police enforcement powers? What about the punishment system? How far do we want to extend our critique of violence and state violence here? And what exactly do we mean by war? Again, it could extend in a variety of directions, either minimally or maximally. I think there's some overlap here between the absolute version and the maximal version. But again, it's possible to be an absolute pacifist about war and still say that the death penalty is justifiable. I can imagine someone saying this. And that other kinds of state violence are justifiable. 2.3, universal versus particular pacifism. Here, I'm thinking about who has the obligation towards peace or towards pacifism. The universal claim would say that everyone should be committed to peace. Therefore, if you're not committed to pacifism, you're doing something immoral, you're doing something wrong. It seems like that's the most consistent, coherent point of view, but there are many who claim that pacifism doesn't have universal, doesn't have a universal pull in that way. For example, it's possible to say, conscientious objection, some version says this, that I object to this use of violence, but it's okay for other people to go along with it. This can sound like a kind of relativism, to say that, well, at the particular level or the personal level, I'm against it, but you're not, and well, that seems to be okay. One way that this gets fleshed out is in terms of vocational sorts of pacifism, where a priest, for example, disavows the use of violence as a matter of his vocation, a personal commitment, and yet the priest can facilitate and help the military power that's engaged in war, which seems to be a kind of problem from the pacifist standpoint. But one way to, I guess, allow for that is to talk about the difference between universal application of pacifism and a more particular kind of commitment. Another way of discussing this kind of problem is to ask the following kind of questions. Is pacifism morally required, universally? Is it morally permitted, which means that you can do it, you can commit yourself to pacifism, but it wouldn't be wrong not to? Or is pacifism a kind of supererogatory commitment that one's not required to be a pacifist, but for priests and doctors and whoever else, really good guys, then we give them extra special bonuses for committing themselves to pacifism. Again, there's a variety of ways that this is fleshed out, discussed. 2.4, skeptical pacifism, or prima facie pacifism. This is the version of pacifism that I've talked about in my book, Practical Pacifism. And the idea here is that pacifism comes from a skeptical standpoint, that while it might be a nice idea that war is justifiable, that violence can be justifiable, I'm waiting to hear the argument. Convince me. It's sort of a kind of, you hold yourself in this kind of stasis point. Prove to me that violence is justifiable. And this skeptical version of pacifism, you throw the burden of proof over onto the defender of war and the defender of violence. We talk more about that at some point in the discussion. Number 3 on the handout, consequential pacifism. With 3 and 4, I'm going to talk about moral arguments that would lead us towards pacifism. Again, I think I've shown that it's quite a complicated topic. Now, when we start talking about moral arguments, the question should always be, well, which version of pacifism are we talking about with regard to these moral arguments? Again, it's a huge topic. But the consequential arguments in favor of pacifism, there's 2 ways that this might go, kind of act utilitarian approach and a rule utilitarian approach. The act utilitarian approach would probably be more like the contingent version that I talked about earlier, where we look at the harms and benefits with this particular war and this particular social structure and this particular military structure, and we say, well, the harms of war are so severe that any benefit that war might provide are outweighed. Right? So the utilitarian argument say, well, war is no good, cannot provide the goods that we might think it would provide. That's going to be flexible, though, this analysis, this kind of situational analysis, because different wars in different contexts might provide different outcomes consequentially. Part of this is going to require a little empirical information. What are the goods that war actually provides? We need historical conversation about this in the past, how wars worked, and what goods have come out of war, etc. Again, it's an open question. Does utilitarianism lead you to pacifism? Not exactly clear. There's going to be arguments on both sides. The rule version of utilitarianism would say, well, it's not about the specific goods of this particular war, it's about the general principle of war, that if we have a general principle that says that war is bad, then in the long run, there will be more social utility than not. So we can commit ourselves to utilitarianism by talking about general prohibition against war. Again, I think this is going to depend on a kind of empirical analysis. Do we think that war provides goods or not? It's an open argument on that. I think, well, I'll leave that at that. Let me just remind you, and this points to point 3.1 here about active nonviolence. Let me remind you, when we do this kind of consequential analysis, we've got to be careful how we formulate the question. It's not, the question is not, will war provide goods as opposed to doing nothing? Right? That skews the answer in a way. The question is, how can we weigh the goods of going to war compared to kind of active and creative commitment to nonviolent alternatives and solutions to social problems? Like most people who argue against pacifism want to say, well, you just can't stay home and do nothing. But most pacifists do not say that one should stay home and do nothing. Rather, there's supposed to be active and creative engagement that will produce social good. So again, the consequential analysis is going to have to weigh out harms and goods from war versus active nonviolence. Deontological versions of pacifism. This has, I think, more in common with the absolutist version that I was talking about earlier. The deontological argument would probably come from a basic commandment or duty: don't kill. Right? It's never justifiable to kill. War is a kind of killing, therefore war is wrong. Immediately, this can get quite complicated if we talk about how the doctrine of double effect might apply. If we talk about maybe some people can be killed and others should not be killed, we need to start making distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, who deserves to be the victim of violence and who doesn't. More maximal, kind of absolutist versions of deontological pacifism will say, don't kill anyone. It's not, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants is irrelevant for some versions of deontological pacifism. You simply shouldn't kill. A more subtle version of this will be responsive to the combatant-non-combatant distinction. I mean, just war theory, I mean, this is an important topic when thinking about discrimination in just war theory. A deontological approach might say, well, it's okay to kill those who put themselves up to be killed. So if you wear the insignia, if you carry weapons, if you stand forth in battle, maybe the prohibition on killing doesn't apply to those kind of persons. The just war theory reminds us, well, for the most part, the just war theory says you can kill combatants, but non-combatants have a kind of immunity. They shouldn't be the target of violence. The ontological version of pacifism that's sympathetic or receptive to the combatant-non-combatant distinction might still conclude, well, the problem with modern mechanized warfare is that the non-combatant-combatant distinction breaks down when you're talking about war that uses cluster bombs, landmines, aerial bombardment, all this other stuff that seems to indiscriminately kill non-combatants. Again, deontological pacifists might accept the doctrine of double effect and say, well, but look at the way our military works. The doctrine of double effect just doesn't really apply. It's manipulated, and we don't do a good job of discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. Let me just sum up the conceptual analysis and then we'll go to the arguments. That last claim that I made about combatant, non-combatant distinction and how pacifism might develop out of the just war theory, there's a version of pacifism called just war pacifism that developed in the Cold War period. And just war pacifism, I'm very sympathetic to this point of view, says that the just war theory is a great theory, but in practice doesn't quite work because of the modern mechanized way that warfare functions. This developed, especially in the 70s and 80s. Catholic thinkers were worried, especially about nuclear deterrent strategy, where the goal or the strategy is, we will threaten to kill every civilian in your civilization in order to deter you from doing the same thing to us. And as people thinking about this pointed out, well, that's immoral on the face of it, because the intention is to kill all the non-combatants over in the enemy civilization. So just war pacifism developed out of the worry about nuclear war, about war that uses weapons of mass destruction, cannot be moral, according to the standards of the just war theory. So I'm pretty sympathetic to that point of view. Now let me, how are we doing on time?
We're good. We had 45 minutes.
And how many more minutes do we have?
No, we have a total of about 45, 50 more minutes.
Okay, so 15 more minutes to talk about arguments, pro and con, and then discussion?
Yeah.
Okay. Notice I'm skipping number 5 there on the handout. This would just, and we could talk about this, but this opens a whole other complicated can of worms about how culture and religion, et cetera, applies. In the discussion, I'm going to have to bring it Gandhi and Jesus and all this other stuff, which is interesting, but let's move forward, okay? Last part, objections and replies to pacifism. As I mentioned, I think at the beginning, most people think pacifism is just really stupid, that only idiots really believe it, or sheltered people that don't have a clue about reality. I think that just is a egregious ad hominem argument. I mean, there are quite intelligent, passionate, moral people that are committed to pacifism. So part of my interest here in going through this is to remind people that it's not a stupid position to hold. First objection: that pacifism is for cowards, free riders, traitors, and other vicious persons. This is kind of ad hominem, but there's something to this. The worry is that if you're a pacifist, it's because you're afraid to fight, right? You say, I don't want to be killed. I prefer to stay home and hide out in my bunker. So goes this worry about cowardice. The free rider objection says that, well, it's easy for you to be a pacifist when the soldiers are out in the field actually doing the fighting. You know, you get to sit home and talk about peace, blah, blah, blah. Good for you, but other people are dying and killing in defense of your pacifism. That's a worry. The traitor objection, do you hear how this might work? That if the nation state is committed to the project of warfare, that's in the national self-interest, and you say no, not interested in the project, then in a way you betray the national interest. One way of putting this, Jen Narveson, who's a guy who's written articles arguing against pacifism, he says, this is a recent article, he says, he lumps pacifists and terrorists together in this article. He says they're both kooks. He says about pacifists that they have too many friends. You hear that? That pacifists, I mean, think about Jesus' commandment, love your enemies. That's treason. Love your enemies. There's a kind of traitorous aspect.
Probably not a problem in Narveson.
And other kinds of vice, these vicious persons. Maybe pacifists are just lazy. They don't want to take up the burdens of defending themselves or their nation. Another version of this, and I mentioned this because it's Colorado, and Ward Churchill was here in Colorado. Maybe he still is here.
Yes.
Anyway, he wrote this book, Pacifism as Pathology. And in the book he claims that pacifism is a vice of the privileged classes. That the privileged folks can say, oh, we're nonviolent, committed to peace, when oppressed peoples around the world have no other choice but to take up arms and fight against the powers that oppress them. You hear those kind of objections to pacifism. So here's an attempt at an answer. First of all, the reply to the cowardice argument, one could argue that no, actually pacifism takes a whole lot of courage, especially if the pacifist is willing to absorb harm, right? You think of Martin Luther King, and he talks about how he knew that he's going to be attacked. He found some higher faith or power that gave him the courage to go on and to continue to mobilize for social change, despite the fact that he knew he was going to be harmed. So it takes courage, and it's not cowardice. The free rider problem, this may not be a satisfactory answer, but one possible answer is that there are higher goods than the goods of the nation state. This, I think, overlaps with the traitor or treason objection too. And there are some pacifists who are outright anarchists and say, look, this whole thing about defending the nation state and all the rest of this, they say, I'm just not interested in this. Tolstoy kind of goes in this direction, kind of Christian anarchist pacifism. A more contemporary version of this is Stanley Hauerwas, who Christian pacifist, and he says, his obligation as a Christian pacifist is to follow Jesus and not the president or the Senate or whoever. Hauerwas, at some point he said, when he goes to baseball games, he refuses to stand for the national anthem. As part of this, which again, maybe that sounds like treason, maybe it's kind of traitor standpoint, but Hauerwas and others will argue, well, they're just higher goods than the goods of the nation state. With regard to this pacifism as pathology argument, you have to bring in some of the other arguments about the consequences of pacifism, about how effective violent revolution would be, and whether there's other more effective solutions, nonviolent social activism. And I think that Churchill attack is just really kind of superficial ad hominem argument, because if you think about the people who are committed to active, nonviolent social protest, it's not that they're saying, well, look at us privileged first world people, or however you want to put this. They're actually out there laying their lives on the line and putting their energies into changing the world. I think that objection doesn't hold. Second objection. These objections overlap a little bit. This is the worry that pacifists are morally wrong to aspire to have clean hands. And this often is articulated from a religious standpoint, that it simply is bad theology to say that, for example, in the Christian faith, that one should be like Jesus, because we ain't like Jesus. Jesus was the perfect being who, he may have been the exemplar of pacifism, but none of us are Jesus. We live in a different world than that, in which there's evil. Evil must be opposed, just war kind of language. Therefore, to say that you want to keep your hands clean is immoral, immodest, and it doesn't understand actually the way that God or structured the world, or the way the world actually is structured. Michael Walzer, this clean hands thing, Walzer wrote this famous article in the 70s about dirty hands, and Walzer puts it like this. He says, the moral politician has to get his hands dirty. And it's important, he says, the moral politician. That is the moral choice for the politician, to use violence, to negotiate with the dark side, to choose lesser evils. Walzer says that is the obligation of the moral politician. And pacifists can't do that. They're not going to make compromises with the dark side. That language is a little hyperbolic. I somehow thought of Darth Vader there. I was thinking compromising with the dark side. The reply to this is, the reply is going to start getting quite complicated, but it has to do with how the commands of morality function in our personal life. How seriously are we to take the commands of deontological ethics, or the commands of an absolutist approach to ethics? The pacifist, for the most part, would reply that morality trumps everything else. That if morality requires one to keep one's hands clean, then that's what you do. The rest of it will take care of itself, because morality is the first thing we should care about. So the Walzer kind of compromise with evil view, the pacifist would say, well, more or less, if you compromise with evil, then you're evil, so what's the point, right? There has to be some other command on us, keep our hands clean or avoid violence. With regard to Christian pacifism, because that's, a lot of the discourse in contemporary thinking about this is Christian discourse, there's this idea, John Howard Yoder points this out in some of his work. He says that, with Augustine and Constantine, Christianity just made a bargain with the devil. He's just putting exactly those terms, but he calls it lapsed kind of Christianity. That prior to the Constantinian compromise, Christians actually were interested in keeping their hands clean. And Yoder says that's what Christianity should be. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to accept this view. You can say, well, moral commandments are primary, and any kind of negotiation with lesser evils, those just shouldn't be on the table. With the hope, the added kind of emphasis that, well, if everyone took this requirement seriously, then actually things would work out for the better. Let me just throw in a little last word on this objection. Religious pacifists have an easy answer for this, which is that by refusing to make those compromises, you enter into a higher sphere of compensation. So the Christian pacifist can say, I'll keep my hands clean, I'll refuse to comport with evil, but then in the next life I'll be rewarded duly. Non-religious pacifists, it's going to be a different kind of argument about, the commands, the requirements of morality. Last objection, and then we'll have an opportunity for conversation about this. This is the claim that pacifism is self-contradictory, unjust, and just not effective. The self-contradictory objection, Jan Narveson makes this one as well. Here's the way Narveson puts it. He says, you doesn't say this way, but you pacifists, you claim that you're committed to the importance of life and how much you love life, but you're not willing to do what it takes to defend life. And sometimes what it takes to defend life is violence, and you actually have to take life in order to defend life. To claim that you love life or love persons or respect persons or however you want to put this, but not be willing to take up the obligations of violence is contradictory. Or, let me make this more stark, there's a kind of performative contradiction. If you claim that life is such a wonderful thing that you should not kill, as a pacifist, you open yourself up to the possibility of being killed by the evildoers out in the world. So what in the heck are you talking about? You worry that there's a contradiction. Related to this is this claim that it's unjust. And this is the claim that is made by Christian just war theorists like Paul Ramsey, for example. Ramsey will say that, well, it's love of neighbor, that requires us to kill some other people. Because we love our neighbors, we kill those who want to harm our neighbors. So the claim is made that in the name of justice, in the name of morality, violence must be used. And this last thing about it not being effective. The worry here is that, in the real world, people have got to fight if they want to get anything done. Some of these critics will argue against some of the, pacifists throw up these examples like Martin Luther King's struggle for civil rights or Gandhi's struggle in India. And critics will say, well, it may look like it was pacifism that was effective in those circumstances, but really what it was the British were just exhausted from participation in the wars, and they were done with the colonial project, so Gandhi's nonviolent movement, it was just, it was inevitable that the British would have pulled out of India, or a different way that this goes about the effectiveness of pacifism. May have looked effective, but look, the British were nice guys to begin with. So no matter what Gandhi did, I don't know, the British would have figured it out on their own. So goes the criticism. In light of this criticism, furthermore, the critic will say, but look, Gandhi may have been successful against the British, but what are you going to do against the Nazis that are, committing genocide? How are you going to do a salt march or something to, protest against Nazism? Won't work, says the objection. Reply to this objection. The first part about the contradictory nature of pacifism. One could retort, well, pacifism is no more contradictory than the idea that you could kill to defend life. Pacifism is kind of a smart aleck remark, but I mean, it's not enough to say that there's a contradiction on the face of it. There's a lot more complicated issues here. What does it take actually to respect life, to defend life, to respect persons? And pacifists will say, well, there's all kinds of things you can do to respect life and defend persons, short of killing other persons along the way. Pacifists say there's actually no contradiction here, or maybe the contradiction lies in the idea that you can kill in order to prevent further killing. With regard to the effectiveness argument, and then this is my last point here. Let me take you back to that discussion of consequential pacifism. There's an idea, I think that many critics have, that the effectiveness of pacifism, or pacifism means do nothing. And if you do nothing, clearly it will be ineffective, right? So go to war is doing something, right? But pacifists remind us that it's not about doing nothing, it's about actually doing something. And some of these folks make an argument that says, as Gandhi talks about the nonviolent army. If only there was sufficient support and resources and education and preparation for active, creative, imaginative, nonviolent activity, if only nonviolence was supported in the same way that the war system is supported, then maybe nonviolent alternatives would be at least as effective as war at providing social change. I think that's important to talk about, at least as effective. You don't have to say, I don't think as a pacifist, that pacifism is going to be more effective than war. It's got to be at least as effective, which means that then it's an open question, well, which strategy works better in terms of effectiveness? And then with regard to that last claim about, I don't know, that people say, well, Gandhi doesn't count because the British were nice people, or there's the other claim that Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, well, that kind of worked because people were really afraid of the Black Panthers. They were afraid of real violence, so they went to King because King offered a more pleasant sounding alternative. Yeah, maybe, okay, maybe there's some of this in the historical background, but when you look at Gandhi and King and Cesar Chavez and some of these other nonviolent activists, it's clear that nonviolence and commitment to peace actually can be effective in the world. Anyway, I'll stop at that point. I talked enough, I think. Let me hear your questions and comments. Criticisms.
I have criticism. about religion, what you just said about that people, you want to be good, so you're going to be rewarded for it in the next life or something like that. To me, I mean, I never liked religion. I always think it's like a really bad thing, because if you're religious, that means you don't think for yourself, and you don't do, you let Jesus or whoever you believe in do your thinking for you, really. So, I mean, to say that you're doing something good so you are rewarded in the next life, what about you doing something now so that there is better life for the future, rather than just thinking of yourself and saying, I'm doing this. It sounded really selfish.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, most of the religious folks that you talk to, I mean, that are committed to nonviolence, it's not about themselves at all.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's about the community, and it's about the well-being of the world. It's about social justice and the rest of this. I mean, maybe there are some really self-interested Christians that just want to have clean hands and, retreat to the mountaintop or something. But most of the people that call it, the Christian pacifists, are actually committed to a much larger idea. And yet, I mean, this was the point of my claim, that, I mean, there's the worry that, I mean, the real world, you gotta go out and kick some ass every so often. You gotta go out and do some harm in order to create some good, right? And the religious view offers a different scheme where if you ignore the requirement for going out and kicking ass, you can still hope that there's some other kind of redemption or compensation or reconciliation in the other world. And non-religious adherents of nonviolence, they don't have that easy out. They can't just appeal to the other world. They've got to talk more about what happens in the real world, or whatever the real world happens to be at this point. And I think that's maybe why you don't hear of as many humanistic absolute pacifists. Absolute pacifism tends to be a kind of religious position. I mean, I can imagine a humanist who's an absolute pacifist, but there's not many of them. Most of the absolute pacifists you run into have a religious background. Yeah, Dave?
I was just wondering, I think you might have alluded to this, but do pacifists have a philosophy of education? Because, when you pose these examples where there's a war that's about to break out, and then the pacifist is posed with the question, it's very difficult for almost any philosophy to survive certain very problematic examples. But yet, for people who, we were talking about this morning, people who talk about departments of peace or peace studies are actually thinking about, the creation of characters of people who don't want to fight. I mean, most of us don't fight. Most of us don't fight in our lives. So the idea that pacifism would be foreign to most people is a nonsensical idea, because most of us haven't had a physical fight, in a very long time. I hope.
Ever, yeah.
Yeah, or ever.
Yeah. No, that's I mean, this relationship between personal and political pacifism, between personal nonviolence and war, that's hugely important, what you just said about this, that for some reason, I mean, we can think about, I mean, if I were mugged, I'd probably fight back or something, but we don't encounter those sorts of situations. And yet, many people, and most people would say, well, you should try to work it out. If your neighbor's pissing you off, you don't just go over and blast them away. I don't know, try to talk with them or something. Most people agree with this. But then we kind of set that aside when we think about war. Well, okay, clearly war is justifiable. Yeah, there's a sort of disconnect there. I agree with you on that. You said about education, these people are talking about, the long-term project of active, creative nonviolence. Clearly there has to be an education component with this. And one, I mean, I talked about this a little bit in the article, William James and this idea of the moral equivalent of war, where, instead, I mean, because there's great things that come through the war system, James says, there's courage and manliness and all this stuff. Wonderful to go out and run around with the boys and shoot guns or whatever, ride your horses or whatever it would have been. But you can do that in a nonviolent context. And the nonviolent context can also inculcate other more humane values than just the warrior values. And I think James is kind of pointing us in this direction. And clearly, as you suggest, part of the educational process in the university with departments of peace studies where they talk about reconciliation and restorative justice and all these different notions that push us away from just fighting and retribution. This is part of the project, which I think is hugely important.
So I guess just a quick follow-up. I guess the part of the question is a metaphilosophical one, which is that it seems as if you're trying to work out definitions of pacifism and to take on problematic cases, which in a way can't be dealt with because the problem of war and peace are ones of character and are gradual problems. In other words, you're testing pacifism in a way that puts it up against sort of analytical problems that maybe aren't fair to pacifism.
I'm not sure this responds to this directly, but I like the virtue account that you can provide for pacifism. That it has to do with a whole system of virtues. I would call them humane kind of virtues. Tolerance, forgiveness, love, patience, generosity. All these other virtues would have to be part of an educational project that would, transform our thinking about this. There's that side of things. But then there is, of course, just the claim is war right or wrong, which is, we have to address that claim as well. But there has to be a virtue story about this too that would connect to the education project.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the most compelling debates between pacifism and the use of violence is that famous debate between Gandhi and Buber, where, essentially I think Gandhi is making the most compelling case for nonviolence. And Buber, in a way, is making this remarkably compelling argument against that. And it's Buber, it's not Donald Rumsfeld. But, on the Gandhi side, there's sort of this Platonic structure, metaphysics, if you will, not unlike in the Credo, that acts of injustice will only lead to destruction of the soul, acts of justice will benefit the soul. So an act of violence is going in the wrong direction. Any act of violence is going in the wrong direction. But there's also this devotional characteristic of Gandhi, the sarvodaya, which is the uplifted of all of us, that we are actually, there's this tremendous commitment to our opponent, that we're going to engage with our opponent nonviolently, in the greatest respect for them, to uplift them and not just ourselves. So that tremendous respect for the opponent. And when Buber essentially responds to Gandhi's letter about, after Kristallnacht, that the Jews in Germany should use something to the effect of the satyagraha techniques in the face of Nazism, that Buber responds, you're up against a diabolic, inhuman steamroller, that I don't want to use violence, but if it's the only way to prevent the evil from destroying the good, I will have to use violence. And it's heartbreaking because what Buber gives up is his very notion of the I-thou relationship, that in the diabolic human steamroller of Nazism, you have an opponent that cannot be embraced, that there can be no devotion to such an individual. And I find the debate just absolutely heartbreaking when Buber, and again, not Donald Rumsfeld, but Buber has to give up his I-thou relationship in the face of a Nazi, and will have to use violence in order to prevent evil from destroying the good. And I must admit, I'm left speechless with that particular problem. I'm wondering if you can illuminate how the pacifist can come to Gandhi's aid.
I'm laughing because oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, Gandhi quit too early.
Yeah. I guess you reminded us that Gandhi's approach has this much larger, holistic, metaphysical view where the fasts and all the rest of the stuff that he would do as part of the movement was because of the interconnection of persons, and when there was violence, he would fast in order to atone for the violence that he didn't commit.
Yeah.
Which is quite a complicated religious standpoint. That I bring suffering on myself in order to alleviate the sins of others.
Like Socrates, like Christ.
It's strange, and it requires a big leap of faith. That's the religious standpoint. As opposed to, what do you do in order to prevent genocide? That's a tough one. It requires, delving into the depths of our religious metaphysical commitments. Well, only one possible answer to this. I don't think it's satisfactory. This just can be a tragic conclusion about this. But a pacifist might argue, even with regard to the Nazi threat, that when you total up the great big scheme of harms and benefits, even in a war against Nazism, it's not exactly clear that war is any better than a creative, active, imaginative, nonviolent response. Now, it doesn't seem to be the case, you know, I mean, and history doesn't seem to bear this out. You might also throw in terms of thinking about this, is in order to defeat an evil enemy of that sort, what compromises with evil do we have to make along the way? We were talking about this in the hallway yesterday about, you know, how the Allies prosecuted the war against the Nazis involved all kinds of atrocities as well. You know, carpet bombing and the use of fire bombs and atomic weaponry, etc. A pacifist might say, this shows us the problem, that while war seems like the answer, it's not exactly the best answer, because war produces just as much suffering along the way.
But it's also, if I could just follow up, maybe a radical difference in a metaphysical viewpoint with respect to the notion of the good. Because Gandhi is assuming that no action on his part can destroy the good, and no action on the part of anyone can destroy the good. It's only his relationship to it. And not in a selfish way, because the sort of Udaya devotional notion of bringing everyone to it. Where I think Buber is actually thinking the good can be destroyed. The good can actually suffer from the slings and arrows of violence. And so to prevent that, it's like, you know, protecting a museum, you don't want the relics to be destroyed. And it really sets a tremendous opposition between, you know, metaphysical opposition in the forces of pacifism versus those who very reluctantly would use violence. And again, Buber is very reluctantly using violence. He has to actually give up I-thou relationship in order to commit to violence in that case.
Yeah.
But I think there's a metaphysical separation.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to the Augustinian tradition, this idea of evil and how, how evil functions in the world, etc. You just, in terms of the conceptual analysis that I presented here, that maybe helps. And Russell, because Russell had this kind of view too, that war is wrong, well, except for this one, the Second World War. You know, it's possible to call yourself a pacifist and still live in the real world, meaning that, yeah, you know, I'm committed to this 98% or 99% or however many percent I can be committed, but there may be exceptions. And these exceptions may be forced upon us by the nature of reality. The same thing I would say with, like, you know, I mean, I'm a vegetarian, but if I were starving on a desert island, I'd probably kill the cat that was with me, or the dog, my pet dog, I'd probably eat the dog, you know. And I mean, that's a different kind of absolute pacifist would say, no, you never eat your pet dog, you know, or you never fight back. But there's a continuum along the way. I think it's important to remember the continuum. It's easy to push the pacifist into a corner and say, well, if you wouldn't fight against the Nazis, then you're a nutcase.
Yeah.
And not every pacifist will say that they wouldn't fight against the Nazis, right? Buber, you suggested, Russell and others.
Well, and it also might be an appropriate response to the Nazis from Buber's position, but if you're confronting something like the War on Terror, Buber might say, hey, you know, I'm seeing evil destroying the good here, but violence is not going to be the way to handle this problem. So you could have it could be a strategy.
Yeah, and then it requires some prudential
Yeah.
considerations, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, talking about the real world and practical pacifism, do you have a crystal ball as regards to this idea of the ministry of peace? I'd be interested to know, you know, when that idea originated and whether you think it might, you know, materialize in Western democracies or anywhere in there.
I have no crystal ball. I mean, I understand the idea. Here's one of my worries that actually motivate the book, is that our culture is a warrior culture, militarist culture, and even if the powers that be talk about peace, they usually don't mean it. And I think Richard Nixon at one point called himself a pacifist in the midst of the Vietnam War, and in many warriors. I mean, the Department of Defense sounds like, you know, we're holding back here, waiting to be attacked, but it's not defense at all. It's Department of Aggression or something, you know. So I mean, I'd be worried about how ideology would warp this sort of thing. And yet, I mean, many of these people are talking about creative, active, imaginative nonviolence.
But
claim that you need some institutional, you know, help.
Do you ever think about the sort of really long-term, you know, human evolution, where the idea is that in the Paleolithic we were a matriarchal culture and we lived peacefully, and then this patriarchal war culture, but now the paradigm is changing, and that we may be moving back to a more, getting in touch with our feminine side, or the warmongers, and that the very idea of a ministry of peace might actually, herald something in the future which we wouldn't be cynical about entirely.
Yeah. I mean, Gandhi says something along these same lines that we're doing better and better and better, and Albert Schweitzer kind of hinted in that direction. I mean, but where's the future going to go? I don't know. Here's maybe one possible hope about this. I'm sympathetic to this. It's the peace of a just and tranquil order. I'm sympathetic to the liberal democratic peace idea. And you asked about the history of the idea of a ministry of peace. Pacifists, they weren't exactly pacifists, but European thinkers for a few hundred years have been talking about this. Kant, Rousseau kind of hinted at this, the Abbé of St. Pierre, and these other people are saying that, well, once we get our own domestic politics organized correctly, then internal problems will fall apart or fall away, and so will international problems, and eventually we'll have peace. And it kind of worked, in Europe. It took a whole lot of bloodshed along the way, and it was a lot of misery and some genocides along the way. But maybe we're at that point in the European sphere of things. In the post-nation-state era, maybe that's what we need to aim at. But man, it's a long project to get there, I think. I mean, if anything's going to solve the problem, so maybe this liberal democratic piece might. Yeah.
Following up on a couple of these other questions, I was hoping you might be able to say a little bit about the overlap, if any, between pacifism and care ethics and the work that may be going on there. And what's making me think of this is that, as several folks have said, we have this very sort of warmongerish society that is also at the same time grounded in justice and equality, right? And care ethics is trying to provide this alternative framework, and not just an alternative viewpoint, but a different way of framing the entire question as well as a different solution to it. So I'm wondering if pacifism falls into the same challenges, which is you can't escape the presuppositions of just war theory in a certain sense, and you're struggling for this different framework as well as a different solution, and at the same time trying to bridge the gap in your contingent pacifism and particular pacifism, which is, well, let's be primarily pacifist and still be able to talk about things like just war. So I'm wondering if you could say anything about
No, I
this.
think there's obviously an overlap and parallel there. The problem with the just war story is that this language of justice can be used to claim that war is morally necessary, morally required. If you don't fight, there's something wrong with you morally. On the other hand, that's the beauty of the just war tradition too. It tells us when we must fight. That's the virtue of it. But that it doesn't seem to allow for any pliability in thinking about how we're going to react in the world. The language of justice, it's important to have a critical view on that. In terms of the care, what you said about care, what popped into my head is that Christian pacifists tie the commitment to peace to the idea of love. And Jesus' commandment to love your neighbor and also love your enemy. And that sounds to me, I don't know enough about the care ethics story. I've read a few things here and there, but it sounds to me like where that goes. That love of neighbor requires a connection and a solidarity that takes in the whole being of the other in a way that's different from just giving them what they deserve according to principles of justice. And I think many of the pacifists, especially Christian pacifists, are very sympathetic to that point of view. That's what Jesus was telling us, that you need to go and be the good Samaritan, which means not just throwing him a buck on the way,
Right.
but take him to the hotel and put him up and hire a doctor and call his parents or whatever it is. I don't know if that was a very good answer, but I think they're connected.
It is, and I think this is why Buber's shift is so tragic.
Yeah.
Exactly, because he had to shift away from this love.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering about the specificity of war in discussions of pacifism, because in a way, what makes me sympathetic, at least a bit, to what Ward Churchill had to say, was that it seems like the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, it's just part of a continuum of U.S. foreign policy, so that we've been engaged in low-grade war around the world for decades. The Cold War was not really peace, it was just wars in Asia, Central America, and so the U.S. is committed to a kind of coercive activity with respect to lots of different nation states, exploiting natural resources around the world and so on. And war becomes an option only when other forms of coercion break down. But I can understand a critic saying what is disingenuous about the American pacifist is the idea that we're not already morally implicated in lots of different ways, so that you're being too selective in a way when you say, okay, let's not bomb anybody, but we'll do all these other things.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. It goes back to these, in terms of defining peace. This just and tranquil order, so-called, you know, I mean, American hegemony provides for the just and tranquil order from the American point of view. That, you know, if American global dominance can extend far enough, then we will have the just and tranquil order that serves American interests, and that's the worry here. Yeah, and the positive peace approach is going to bring in a whole bunch of other issues that most pacifists are interested in talking about. That, you know, there has to be equality, there has to be respect for human rights, women's rights, there has to be economic equality, there has to be a kind of global democracy. All those have to factor in. And I think, I mean, the Churchill, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's easy for, you know, philosophy professor in Fresno, California to say, I'm opposed to the war. When I live in Fresno, California, never will ever suffer the consequences of any American policy one way or another. It's easy to say, yeah, but most people who are talking about pacifism want to bring in a whole bunch of other things too. And I think Churchill's just kind of, he doesn't recognize the depth of the commitment that most of these pacifists have. That, I mean, these are social activists that are actually going out and trying to change the world for the better, I think.
Yeah, to follow up on that, the idea that, you know, pacifism is just for yuppies kind of breaks down when you look at the Tibetans or the, you know, Gandhi and the Indians. And it seems to me that in, you know, various religious traditions, you know, there's much more deeply entrenched, you know, pacifism in some than in others. And it seems like that would be a whole area that you could debate. And I mean, I'm not even sure whether some, what we call religions, are really religions, and they're not really, you know, philosophies like Buddhism or whatever. So have you looked at that aspect of, you know, I mean, the Quakers, you know, that's their thing, right?
Yeah. No, and around, I mean, around the world, I mean, it's not just Christianity. We could have talked about, you know, Dalai Lama and his view of pacifism, etc. Yeah, it's not just us, you know, the privileged North Americans that talk about it. You're right. Man, I had something else to say about that. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, pass over that one aside.
Go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on actually something David said, the idea of education, and then you talked about at the higher education level, but makes me think about child rearing and culture and the push for change. Obviously has to do with the policy level, but it's almost as if this conversation assumes a kind of human nature, a kind of an aggressive human nature, that perhaps is the outcome of, you know, of all kinds of systems. So, you know, if you run up against, you say, well, you know, somebody like Buber might say, well, my people, you know, we're peaceful people. We don't take up arms. But when it comes to me facing a culture where their whole cultural system is that of taking up arms, what do I do? And, you know, an individual, if you read treatises of people who were in the concentration camps, that was a dilemma. Are we going to become like them? You know, and it's so that the early educational piece and the cultural piece seem very important to me.
Yeah, this question of human nature, the just war.
Yeah.
I mean, not all of them, but many of the just war
people claim, well, human beings have this tendency towards violence.
Right.
It's just kind of assumed, you know. I mean, this is the word, the language evil. You know, there's a sinful fallen nature that we have, and it means that we do bad things to each other. You know, in the book, I had a chapter where I tried to think this through. And one of the things I looked at was the socio-biological reductionist approach, which says that, you know, you may have heard of this thesis that the demonic male thesis. It's the apes, our nearest relatives. They have male-dominant social structure, and they are violent in a certain way. So it ties into human social structure, male dominance, predisposition towards violence. I mean, there's a lot of people who think, well, you know, you'll never get over it because it's just the way people are. I don't buy that at all, actually. And one, you know, there's evidence, you know, the bonobos, you've heard the story about the bonobos, where they're peace-loving hippie apes. You heard about the bonobos?
Yeah.
It's promiscuous, polymorphous sexuality that instead of solving social problems through violence, they just have sex together. And I mean, what is human nature in that? I mean, in terms of the biology of that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean,
There's a good answer to it. Yeah.
I mean, but I think it's an interesting.
They throw free will in there, and then it changes the whole thing too.
It's really an assumption about an aggressive human nature, which.
Yeah, I think it is tied to this understanding of male dominance too somehow. I think there's a connection.
There are a lot of studies that have been in primatology by Diana, Fossey study, you know, all that, the women primatologists who interpret the interactions in a really different way. It's
Yeah,
interesting too.
it's a huge
Yeah.
question. Yeah, but clearly we're cultural beings, though. This
Yeah.
is my thesis in this chapter that, okay, maybe we've got ape heritage. I don't know what it is, but we have culture, you know, and
Right.
culture allows us to change human nature in a way. And one of the things I think is important to remember in light of trying to make pacifism not look stupid, and you reminded us of this, there are cultures that are pacifistic. You know, there are religions that say that that's actually what human beings should aspire to. And there are people that actually live it and enact it, the Quakers and others, you know, the Amish, that actually put this into place when, I mean, that Amish example a couple weeks ago, like, your first instinct is, well, let's kill this, you know, let's go and do something. Oh, why don't we gotta do something? And it was forgiveness and reconciliation and a whole different way of understanding the self and the world and the society. Culture can develop that's peaceful,
Yeah,
I
that
think.
seems to me that would be a way, certainly the piece of this discussion.
The Quakers all went to war in the ambulance service. They were all there in the front lines, you know.
Yeah, Gandhi drove an ambulance, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's
And
another.
they're all conscientious objectors, but they were right there.
Yeah.
You know.
It's another question of how you enact your pacifism. Do you have a commitment to peace? Do you withhold your taxes? You know?
Just the one spent on bombs.
How do you do that? There's a whole bunch of interesting. Yeah. Which taxes do you pay, and who do you pay them to, and what if? I mean, conscientious objection. Then what's the alternative? And there's a lot of complicated, become more like legal, practical questions about how you enact them.
Well, it seems like yesterday in your talk, typically you alluded to just a very simple point of how important critical thinking is. And so, from a practical perspective, you don't even have to convince the vast majority of people that war is wrong. All you have to do is say, "Do you think violence is bad? Yeah. Should we try to resist it? Yeah. How do we try to resist it? We require evidence that it's necessary. How do we require evidence? Critical thinking." So you don't even have to have people sign on to the more dramatic forms of pacifism, just to get vast majorities of people resisting war to a much greater degree than they already do. And then you've taken yourself far down the road that the more committed pacifists want to go.
Wouldn't that be great if that were true, David? I agree. I you know, you said that. I was like, yeah. But we go to war, you know, and our culture. It seems to me, yeah, we should be reluctant to fight wars. That seems to me like a very obvious thing.
Right.
But I don't think it's true for most people. And part of this is our culture of militarism, our history of militarism.
Right.
I mean, you could go on a rant here about U.S. history and the story we tell ourselves about the effectiveness and the justness of U.S. military power. throw in, you know, Rambo movies and all the rest of this,
Football.
you know.
No, I'm not saying that
I mean,
the
it's-
conditioning hasn't all gone the other way.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I'm just saying that if the project is getting the conditioning to go in the other direction, or to get critical thinking to countermand some of the conditioning, you don't have to advance the ideology of pacifism to do it. You have to advance the fairly core set of values that most people profess to have in their everyday life.
Yeah.
And you have to put something at stake for them, so maybe a draft or mandatory service or something like that.
We
Higher-
gotta change
higher
this
gas
budget.
prices.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I would say about this is, because even myself, I don't know how committed I am as a pacifist to pacifism. I would call myself more of just war pacifist. I think the lever to get this going is the just war theory, ultimately. But on a pretty stringent interpretation of the just war theory. And there's some debate about how just war theory gets fleshed out. And I did this in a talk yesterday, I would remind people that the just war theory grows out of Christian pacifism. So at the heart of the just war theory is a reluctance and a presumption against violence, which most people share because they've been raised up in a religious tradition. It doesn't have to only be Christian, but there tends to be a presupposition that violence is bad. Hold out the possibility, yeah, violence might be justified, but man, it's going to be a tough one to actually justify it. Which, I mean, I think works for the most part to say, well, most wars then are not justifiable, or at least this is my skeptical stance. We don't know that wars are justifiable because we don't have access to all the information and strategy, etc. So it's okay for us to be reluctant and resist and make them prove to us, as you suggested. The burden of proof rests on them. Them, now I'm starting to talk in abstract terms, but
Yeah.
the proponents of war.
Yeah.
The burden of proof rests on them.
Well, let's thank Andy for his presentation. We have lots of fruit and cheese and bread.
You like
What do we
that?
not want? When do we not want it now?
Ever.
So you're teaching evolution of consciousness?
Correct it. I mean, I don't have any arguments in favor of, I haven't thought about it, to be honest with you. Maybe he's right, I don't know. But when we're talking about views, and I think Holocaust denial is a good one, that does seem to pose a certain kind of threat, I think it is worth taking them on. And if that means that we have to be agonistic or even antagonistic, okay, I mean, that might be the way to do it. I don't know that sort of peace and not getting in people's faces has to trump always, especially in these cases in which this is a view which is so closely tied to acts of terrorism that we know about, right? It's sort of hard to take the live and let live view. I mean, it might not be the case. I don't know that there have to be some kind of legal action or anything like this. It's just if you think you've got arguments, which they do, let's hear them. Give me the argument. If not for the sake of convincing the people of all these views that they're wrong. I mean, you might not be able to do that, but at least not making it so easy for them to win their case with new people by default, because they're not contesting. Now, of course, just to pick up the earlier part, there are, I would argue, pathologies of argumentation, right? That is that, the next book I'm working on is called Virtue and the Politics of Deliberation, which I think that if there is going to be a sort of call for a fully deliberative kind of politics where we are epistemically, taking on all comers, at least with the stipulation that, the guy who's getting punched by Buzz Aldrin might not have to be refuted, but maybe Holocaust deniers should be. There are certain kinds of vices and certain kinds of virtues that have to be sort of brought to bear on that. That is, if arguments are entered into simply for the sake of winning, then there's, I think, a very strong sense in which that's not deliberation properly. That is, deliberation is a kind of process by which you're trying to find out the truth of something, not just trying to win. So if the discussion is agonistic in a sort of strict sense, right, it's about or if it's heuristic and just about winning, then I think we're failing in a certain sense. I think that it's right to, and one who advocates a deliberative view can be fully critical of Bill O'Reilly or any of these guys, right, who are good instantiations of what I would think of as sort of a vicious sort of, an example of what vicious discussion is, because it's not properly deliberation. But again, what's so interesting, and this is, I'm still working on the first chapter of this book, but this is what the first chapter is about, is how all of these guys, whatever you think about these people, right? Limbaugh, Franken, anybody, even, I'm not talking about whether you agree with them, I'm just talking about the character in which they engage with people who disagree with them. They all promote of themselves the right view of what they're doing, right? They all profess, right? Liars and the lying liars who tell, lying is bad, truth-telling is good, treason is bad, spin is bad, right? Having your judgment beholden to special interest is bad. And all of these seem to me to be exactly proper epistemically. This is, right, they're hypocritical. They're not epistemically mistaken. They have the right epistemology. They just, it's like, to even be more charitable, they're epistemically acratic. It's a case of just weak will. They know the right thing to do and just can't do it. That might even be too charitable, right? But there are cultural questions that have to be introduced about why it is that these vicious kinds of debating sort of forums in which nobody's after truth, it's just after a soundbite that gets them the most cachet on the news, seem to be so popular. I hold out sort of as a little bit of hope that at least in their self-image, they're holding out the right epistemic view. It's just that they're hypocritical or weak-willed or something. Yeah.
Is it not fair to say that amongst liberals there is no overlapping consensus over roles in conception of public reason? And if so, doesn't that make the position self-referentially incoherent on its face?
Well, I think this is a good question in that, and I've argued elsewhere that this is exactly the case. Just think for a second. Rawls's first book, the Theory of Justice book, was, as you might, I'm sure you know, explicitly aimed, targeted against utilitarianism, right? And and other things, intuitionism, whatever. But this was a full frontal attack on utilitarian conceptions of justice. In the later book, right, and this is what the two principles are supposed to be, right? These are anti-utilitarian principles of justice, right? The difference principle, right? And it's even proposed in the first book as, this is superior to any liberal conception, the difference principle, right? Economic inequalities are justifiable only insofar as they can be expected to benefit the worst off. Fair enough. We get to the second book, which has still got the same two principles. But now the idea is that everybody can jump on board, right? Now the idea is that if you're a reasonable Kantian, or if you're a reasonable libertarian, or if you're a reasonable Thomist, or if you're a reasonable utilitarian, you'll accept the difference principle too. But that's crazy. No utilitarian can accept the difference principle. There might be cases in which you will endorse the difference principle because the utilitarian calculus, right, tells him to. But as a principle of justice, no way, right? As a principle of justice, the greatest happiness principle is what justice is, right? So no utility. I think your point is exactly right. This is why. This was, in fact, the argument of the paper that people said, that was great, can you do something else? The idea was that, if the idea is that in order to get political stability, we need a conception of liberalism that, as he says, works like a module, right? It can fit in to whatever you believe. If it's sort of roughly within the sort of spectrum of liberal political theory, you're going to endorse my conception of justice because I could show you that a reasonable utilitarian is going to adopt these two principles, and a reasonable, libertarian is going to adopt them. And the way that he gets this reasonableness claim is that if you deny the fact of reasonable pluralism, you're unreasonable. That is, if you're convinced, what I call sort of an unreconstructed utilitarian, somebody who says the greatest happiness principle is true, and anybody who disagrees with it is wrong, and Kantians are Kantians are wrong, any other alternative view of justice is not as good as this one, right? Or even stronger, is false. And if you hold that view, that is, if you're a real utilitarian, you're unreasonable. And we can coerce you. Rawls doesn't need your consent, right, in the overlapping consensus, because you're an unreasonable. Think about also any other sort of roughly liberal, the Lockean. A real Lockean can't be a reasonable liberal on Rawls's view. Why? Because these doctrines, the utilitarian doctrine, the Lockean doctrine, a straightforward Kantian doctrine, are not themselves pluralist doctrines. They are themselves monist doctrines. They say there's but, for example, for the liberal, for the Millian or the utilitarian liberal, there's but one thing that's of intrinsic value. It's something called pleasure or satisfaction, or however sophisticated you want to get. And maximizing it, however sophisticated you want to get about what maximization is what justice is. And that's not always going to get me the difference principle. So the principle of justice is the greatest happiness principle. What I argue there is that Rawls requires the utilitarian to become what I call a reasonably reformed utilitarian. That is, the utilitarian has to say something in order to be reasonable on Rawls's view. Yeah, I think happiness is the only thing of intrinsic value, and I think that we should maximize it, and I endorse the greatest happiness principle. But hey, I understand that Kantians might be right too, and I could be wrong. And hey, I understand that, there are real hard cases that I might not be able to, that is, the Millian not only has to be kind of epistemically not hubristic and thinking that he's got all the knockdown arguments he needs, but has to hold that sort of, there are hard cases that I don't know if I can sort of respond to as a permanent condition, that there could be, in effect, no knockdown argument for an unsophisticated Benthamite version of utilitarianism. But why in the world would anybody adopt that, unless they're already committed to it, right? So it looks like the group of people to whom Rawls is appealing to get the overlapping consensus becomes very, very narrow, I think, very, very quickly. Because no straightforward, no utilitarian of the sort that we're familiar with is going to agree. Sidgwick could not agree with any of this. You're going to say Sidgwick is unreasonable? Yeah, that's what Rawls is going to say. Well, that seems to me to be crazy. And not only crazy philosophically, but to call that view pluralism is odd as well. Because what is it saying? Everybody's unreasonable except the people who agree with me.
Well, it just seems to me you're not going to get all liberals, self-described liberals, to agree with this, let alone take it to the Iraqi Governing Council and give them an argument for adopting this as normative, and then moreover, what overlapping consensuses are they going to arrive at?
Well, this is right, but the international case, he's not concerned with the international case. He's got a whole separate book about the international case. So the Iraqi government what does a liberal society say to them? But you're certainly right, and Dworkin points this out. The later Rawls can't give anybody a reason to be a liberal, not even people who are already liberals. In fact, what the later Rawls does is take away, right? If we can use this kind of language, emasculates liberalism. There's no argument for it anymore, even for liberals. And of course, even among liberals, there are going to be all kinds of debates about what their commitments really come to, policy-wise. But that's a set of debates that are almost precluded in the Rawlsian system.
At the philosophical level involving substantive principles.
That's exactly right.
Seemingly are ruled out by the very procedure.
Correct. So, you're right. We agree.
Well, I see people are about to rush off to their 4 o'clock classes,
Yeah.
so can we all just thank Rob for coming and checking out?
Thanks a lot.
Your question was kind of big.
I was going to try to step up for Rawls.
Yeah.
He's apparently
What? Okay.
I
didn't know he was so stupid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dave?
So I don't. Yeah.
Are we gonna meet
Yeah.
for dinner, or you just wanna call me, or what do you wanna do?
You're going to class.